we're going to have a look at a compressor, the standard functions on a compressor. We're going to look at the very standard compressor of Pro Tools, just the Dyn3 compressor. So I'm going to show you this example using a snare drum. We already have an EQ applied to the snare drum just to give us a little bit of higher fidelity on that snare drum sound. So compression is definitely one of the more difficult concepts to understand. But ultimately, we are going to first adjust our ratio, which is going to be how much the compressor compresses when the audio goes over the threshold knob. So we're going to start, we turn the threshold all the way up and hit play. We get no compression whatsoever. As you turn your threshold down, we start getting gain reduction, and you can hear the snare drum changing. So then a really important element of the compression is the attack and release. And that allows you to ultimately determine if you're just going to use the compression as a kind of a volume adjuster. So from snare drum, from hit to hit, you want to try to increase the consistency from hit to hit, or do you want to actually use the compressor to manipulate the transients or the envelope of the actual snare drum sound? And it might be a little bit of both, where you're using it for consistency and you're using it to actually manipulate and shape the envelope of the snare drum sound itself. So first of all, if we were to set the attack as fast as it can go, that means the minute the snare drum goes over the threshold, the compression is going to kick in. If we make the release really fast as well, it's going to then immediately turn off. So all we would be affecting on the snare drum sound is the very first point in time when the stick hits the actual snare, the attack of the snare. And when you do that, you'll hear, you actually, as you turn the threshold down, will start hearing the snare drum attack sound will actually kind of filter out a little bit. You'll hear what I'm talking about. Let's check this out. I'm going to turn the threshold up and slowly turn this threshold down. So here's before. So you hear that attack sound of the snare gets kind of smoothed out because we're only affecting the attack portion of the snare drum sound. It's a bit confusing as we say the word attack a whole bunch. So anyways, one option is if we just wanted to kind of control the consistency of every snare drum hit is to have the compressor start right away and then not let go until after the snare drum hits. So you can kind of see how it's following the snare drum hit with this gain reduction. So right now we have this hi-hat bleed and then the snare drum sound. And the snare drum sound's the only thing that is being compressed. The hi-hat bleed is soft enough where it's not actually being compressed. Well, now if I take this gain knob and turn it up to match the level that the snare drum was before, we'll hear that hi-hat bleed get quite a bit louder. So here's bypass. So you can hear we've reduced the dynamics of this entire snare drum track, all the bleed and everything. And that's again with a fast attack and a slower release. And then when we turn that gain up to compensate for this compression that's happening on the snare sound, we can hear all of that bleed, the hi-hat and that get quite a bit louder. So the other option is to, well, and I should say then that every snare drum hit is a little bit more consistent in volume because it's going to reduce the dynamics solely based on the amount of that snare drum sound that's going above the threshold. So that's quite a bit of snare. Or quite a bit of compression. I'm going pretty over dramatic for you. Let me turn the threshold up a little bit and do a little less gain reduction. There we go. So we're getting about 12 dB of gain reduction, which is still a fair amount. Here's bypassed. So the overall snare sound itself is a little fatter sounding. It sounds like there's a little bit more punch to it. But then, of course, that hi-hat bleed is also being manipulated to be louder as well. So the other option is to mold the envelope of the snare drum sound a little bit more, where we actually might slow the attack down. So let me go back to my original example where I have attack and release as fast as it can go. So if we listen here to the threshold, we hear the snare drum, the beginning part of the snare drum sound gets kind of flushed out a little bit. But if I were to take that same sound and pull the attack to be a little bit slower, so that way the compressor isn't kicking in right away, we'll hear that transient sound come back in. So we hear that attack of the attack come a little bit in a little bit faster. And so therefore, the only part of the snare drum that we're compressing is like the second half of it. We're talking about a very short amount of time here, just milliseconds worth of time. But you actually, with this attack and release, can tell the compressor to only focus in on a certain part of the snare drum sound. And in this case, with a slower attack and a faster release, we're only focusing in on the second half of the snare sound. And then by turning the gain up, that means we're turning that release time, or that tail of the snare sound, up without affecting the attack of the snare sound, and ultimately making the snare drum sound punchier and more full. Let's listen again here. So here's without it, and with it. So again, I'm going pretty overboard here. That is a very aggressive amount of compression. So if I wanted a little less, I would turn the threshold up. Now my output's clipping. We can turn the output down so we're not distorting. There we go. Turn that threshold back down a little bit. There we go. Before and after. So now this time, this compressor is being used to actually mold and shape the envelope of the actual snare sound. You can take the same concept with the vocals. So if you want the vocal to be really consonant and kind of a little bit more aggressive and in your face, you might actually have a slower attack and a faster release. So that way the compressor doesn't compress the transients of the vocal, but instead always is compressing just after the transient, which is the a little bit more of the tone and the depth of the voice or the snare or the guitar or whatever the case may be. So there's certainly a lot of different ways that you can manipulate, and a lot of times it's just trial and error, but you can see how that attack and release is a huge benefit as to the way that the compressor works.